Hello and welcome. I'm Asima Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Russia has launched one of the largest drone and missile strikes on Kyiv and surrounding regions since the start of the war, with attacks still ongoing as of 4:20 GMT. At least 4 people have been killed and 9 have been injured, according to Kyiv's military administration. The assault has triggered nationwide air raid alerts and prompted Poland to close airspace near 2 cities. Israeli tanks have pushed deeper into Gaza City's residential areas, including Sabra, Tel Al-Halwa, and Sheikh Radwan and Al-Nasser, with medics warning of dozens of injured people who are still trapped as Israel denied 73 rescue requests. Gaza's health authorities reported at least 21 Palestinians killed in strikes today. The U.S. State Department has announced it will revoke Colombian President Gustavo Petro's visa after his comments were reported from a pro-Palestinian protests in New York. President Petro has now returned to Bogota, declaring that he does not care, further escalating the situation. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called on all UN member states to immediately implement the restored UN sanctions against Iran. The UN sanctions against Iran have now snapped back into force for the first time since 2015, sending the Iranian rial to a record 1.12 million per dollar. South Korea and the United States have reached a foreign exchange agreement, according to South Korean Finance Minister Koo Yeon-chol. The deal is separate from currency swap talks that linked to President Donald Trump's tariffs on South Korea, with President Lee Jae-myung stressing that Seoul cannot pay the $350 billion investment up front. The U.S. President Donald Trump have now authorized full-force troop deployment to Portland to protect ICE facilities from what he calls domestic terrorists, defying Democratic leaders including Oregon Governor Tina Kotek and Portland Mayor Keith Wilson, who has denounced the move. Vietnam has now evacuated thousands and has shut airports as Typhoon Bualoi, with winds up to 133 km per hour, are approaching central regions, expected to make landfall today. The storm followed deadly flooding in the Philippines that killed at least 10 people, prompting urgent precautions. Britain's Labour Party gathered in Liverpool for its annual conference as Prime Minister Keir Starmer faces scrutiny over scandal and plummeting poll ratings amid rising support for Nigel Farage's hard-right Reform UK party. Meanwhile, Finance Minister Rachel Reeves pushes for a post-Brexit youth migration deal with the EU to boost the economy. Now we move on. Russian forces have launched at least 8 attacks overnight on Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, injuring 21 people, including 3 children. A rocket hit an apartment building in the Shevchenkivsky district, causing significant damage to residential blocks and vehicles. Firefighters are conducting rescue operations while authorities assess if anyone remains trapped. The attacks between 1 a.m. local time and 5:30 a.m. local time damaged 14 apartment blocks and 9 private houses. 2 injured are in serious condition. The Russian Defense Ministry stated that overnight Russia carried out a massive strike on Ukrainian military-industrial enterprises used by the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as military airlifted infrastructure. President Zelensky has condemned the strikes as brutal and called for stronger international pressure on Russia. Air raid alerts were issued across Ukraine, and neighboring Poland closed airspace for the 2 cities. Now for this discussion, we are joined by retired Major General Dr. Rajan Kochhar. He's a senior strategic and defense expert, joins us live from New Delhi. Welcome to the NewsX World. Thank you for joining us today. Today, the strikes have continued, we saw that Sergei Lavrov made comments towards EU, NATO, and Ukraine in particular, and NATO in particular. What do you think that is going to happen next? Do you think that EU or NATO will respond back to Lavrov's comments as well?
You see this situation, Suma, the way it is building up, it's very, very clear that Russia is uh, escalating the war. And we have seen in the last 2 to 3 months, there has been a tremendous amount of escalation, not only in Zaporizhzhia, in other areas of Kherson, Kharkiv, and the railway tracks are being targeted. Already more than 10,000 kilometers of railways has been destroyed by the Russians. NATO is trying to flex its muscles now because this war is coming to a decisive stage where possibly Ukraine is not able to defend itself against the Russian onslaught. And what is happening is that uh, Zelensky was banking upon the support of Trump all this while. That has been forthcoming, but not in the measure Zelensky wanted it to happen. The second important aspect is that statements now emanating from Trump do suggest that Trump and NATO are now aligned in their thought that this war, the peace, whatever Trump was trying to project, is not happening, and this war has to be carried forward. If that is the case, I see a lot of escalation on the part of NATO also. Now I can see these voices from Poland, Romania, Germany, and all these countries have started trying to tell Russia that they may join this war, because Ukraine, as I see things, is not able to sustain this and offensive. So I see some movement in the Arctic Ocean taking place now. Russia recently launched its P-700 anti-shipping cruise missile. It was tested about 2 days back. So these are some kinds of provocation on the part of the Russians, also trying to tell NATO that Russia is prepared in case NATO decides to strike. And Lavrov has also made the same statement. He has made the statement that in case NATO decides to launch any kind of a misadventure, the Russians are prepared. And that is a posturing, I would call, because right now no redeployment of forces have taken place either on the NATO side or on the Russian side. Because if these are mere words being played at, because they have to be seen if they are being translated into action, which I don't see as of now, because I don't see any of the NATO forces getting aligned to fight a war with Russia. Neither I see the Russian forces also getting aligned. So as of now, I see this as a political posturing and not more than that. But these are very difficult times, because there is a very thin line between a strike, if it has to happen, because any small incident can trigger a larger war, and I would not like to see the NATO getting involved into this conflict, because the moment NATO gets involved, then we are looking at a third world war scenario.
Right. We also saw that Turkey was suggested by Russia as a place to meet with Ukraine. But Turkey is in NATO, and also Turkey we saw Turkey move its military ship for NATO against Russia in support of Ukraine. Do you think that Turkey is still is a good location for talks, for peace talks for these two countries?
See, Erdogan he is balancing himself, very well, because the last talks happened in Istanbul, and there was a talk of a sequel now, and carrying actually forward the first talk in Istanbul resulted in the exchange of the prisoners, because that was the first step. Ukraine prisoners were handed over and the Russians prisoners were handed over. So that was seen as a positive culmination of the talks which happened in Istanbul. You see, Turkey may be a part of NATO, but it is not totally aligned with the Americans' thought on the Russians, because Turkey and Russia do maintain a good relationship, and I think these are, in case planning is there to hold the next round of talks in Turkey. I don't think Turkey being a part of NATO is going to be of much consequence, because as of now, I don't see NATO coming into the equation of fighting a war with Russia.
Thank you very much, retired Major General Dr. Rajan Kochhar, for joining us and sharing that insight as a strategic and defense expert. Now we move on to our next news. Belarusian Foreign Minister Maxim Ryzhenkov has met with United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres in New York to discuss strengthening the UN's role in international security. The two leaders emphasized the importance of multilateral cooperation in addressing global challenges. The minister expressed gratitude to the Secretary General for supporting Belarusian initiatives at the UN on Chernobyl-related issues, combating human trafficking, and advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. In a separate meeting with UN General Assembly President Anna Elena Baerbock, the Belarusian minister highlighted the need for equal rights among all member states and called for maintaining effective UN governance. Now we move on. Iran has strongly condemned the reimposition of UN sanctions over its nuclear program, calling them legally baseless and urging all countries not to recognize the measures. Commenting on the issue, the Iranian Foreign Ministry has stressed that the Islamic Republic will defend its national rights and interests, and any action aimed at undermining them will receive an appropriate response. The UN sanctions were returned on Sunday. Through the snapback mechanism of the 2015 nuclear deal, these sanctions freeze Iranian assets abroad, halts arms deals, and penalties development of ballistic missiles. Additionally, Iranian lawmaker Ismail Kousari has said that Iranian parliament may discuss possible withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, while Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf has warned that any country implementing the sanctions will face reciprocal action from Iran, including the 3 European nations that triggered the measures. The UN sanctions come after stalled negotiations with the United States and recent Israeli and US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, with Iran still maintaining a stockpile of highly enriched uranium near weapons-grade levels. The economic impact was immediate, with currency tracking websites reporting that the Iranian rial hit a record low against the US dollar today. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you very much, Ross, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, given that Iran's strong condemnation, and it has said that it will take actions against the countries which implement these sanctions, what do you think Iran means by that?
Certainly, there'll be a lot of rhetoric. We've already seen some, but there'll be more statements, very angry statements from the Iranian government condemning the imposition of the snapback sanctions. They might impose their own sanctions, although that's more symbolic than having any practical effect, given that these countries have sanctioned Iran. But the thing to watch here is really whether or not the Iranian government wants to continue to put itself in this position where they're excluded from most of the international trading system. They're hurting their own people, and then they come to rely on primarily on two countries, Russia and China, which have been friendly to Iran, but have their own motivations for doing so, and are not necessarily the best long-term partners for Iran. So ultimately, as has been the case throughout this process, it's up to the Iranian leadership. Do they want to continue to put their country in this worsening economic situation, to be isolated from international trade and other interaction? Or do they want to join the international community of nations for trade and other purposes and give up these research programs that really most of the world is condemning?
And Ross, what are the potential consequences for global diplomacy and security if Iran follows through on its threat to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
It will harden the position of countries that may have been sympathetic to Iran in the past. And we see that with the European countries, the E3. They've been so engaged in this process, notwithstanding criticism from the Trump administration. They've been willing to extend their hand to Iran to try and find a way out from this. And if Iran continues with its research programs, if it leaves the Non-Proliferation Treaty as they're threatening to do, which would be a huge mistake, then Iran is going to continue to be isolated and become even more isolated. And relying on Russia and China is not necessarily a good long-term plan for the prosperity of Iran or even the stability of the government. But to kind of be frank, this leadership often makes stupid decisions. They've done so for decades, and it's often just about keeping themselves in power and keeping their own people enslaved. But the other countries in the region, they certainly don't want to see this happen. They want Iran to be on good terms with its neighbors. But if Iran continues down this path, then we're going to see more actions like the recent agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan with regard to the collective defense and potentially bringing Saudi Arabia within Pakistan's nuclear umbrella.
And Ross, now looking back at the Pezeshkian's speech in UN, he thanked the countries, probably Iran's friends. He did not mention or name the countries, but people who supported Tehran during this Israel-Iran conflict this year. So how does Iran perceive this role of international allies, maybe particularly about Russia and China? And what do you think about Russia and China, which rejected putting these sanctions on Iran?
There's a distinction between countries condemning Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear facilities and actually wanting Iran to have nuclear weapons. Countries might race to Iran's defense to say how terrible it was for Israel to violate Iran's sovereignty, but at the same time, I don't think many of those countries are saying, yes, we want Iran to have nuclear weapons, and the same might even apply to Russia and China. Certainly, those two countries have some interest in supporting Iran. They have some interest in supporting a counterweight in the Middle East to countries that are under U.S. influence. But ultimately, again, is it in Iran's best interest to primarily rely on two countries? I would say no. Again, I think the Iranian leadership is being extraordinarily foolish and stupid, frankly, and that their best interest is to be doing business and allow trade and the flow of people, primarily with Europe and maybe to a lesser extent with the United States if that was feasible again. But the Europeans have shown a great desire to have a normal relationship with Iran, but even for the European countries, there's clearly a barrier now, which is Iran's pursuit of these weapons programs.
Thank you very much, Ross, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we move on. Israeli Defense Forces have said that the Israeli Air Force struck around 140 targets across the Gaza Strip in the past 24 hours, hitting buildings used by terror groups, operatives, and military infrastructure. The Hamas-run Health Ministry has reported that at least 77 Palestinians were killed, including 21 in airstrikes on residential areas. Ground troops from 3 IDF divisions continue to push into Gaza City today. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks moved deeper into neighborhoods including Sabra, Tel Al-Hawa, and Sheikh Radwan and Al-Nasser, raising concerns about civilians sheltering in the city. The military offensive continues as they launched on September 16. They have forced hundreds to flee. These developments come as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to meet U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House tomorrow to discuss possible deal to end the conflict and secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas last year. Ahead of this meeting, thousands of Israelis rallied in Tel Aviv for a comprehensive deal to end the war and bring all hostages home, holding banners and urging immediate actions. Now for this discussion, we go back to Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you very much, Ross, for staying with us. Now, looking at this continued Israeli attack or Israel's military strikes on Gaza, what do you think Israel has left to say to the world in defense of the current situation in Gaza?
Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear in his speech to the United Nations last week. Israel is going to continue this war until Hamas is destroyed, and if that includes fighting within Gaza City, an urban area where there's still civilians nearby, that's going to proceed, and it doesn't matter how much international criticism is made of Israel, Netanyahu's policies remain unchanged. So this is the situation that has been on the ground pretty much since the war began in October 2023. As the civilian casualties mounted, the war has continued. Israel really ignores the international criticism. And Netanyahu's made very clear what his goals are. His goal is the elimination of Hamas and the return of the hostages. Hopefully some of them are still alive, but if not, then the return of their remains. So these two goals, the defeat of Hamas, the complete defeat of Hamas, not some kind of partial defeat that leaves Hamas with its weapons or still in control of sections of Gaza. The defeat of Hamas and the return of hostages are Israel's goals. And no amount of international criticism causes Israel or Netanyahu to vary from that. So the fighting continues. And unfortunately, again, it comes at a high cost of civilian deaths and casualties.
Ross, we've also seen the opposition voice increase in Tel Aviv domestically as well as internationally towards the current Israeli government, also considering Israel's lack of cooperation with UN resolutions. Do you think Gazans or Palestinians still are hopeful about reaching a diplomatic approach, considering that tomorrow Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump are supposed to talk? What do you think will be reached, or do you think they should or they can stay hopeful for this?
One could stay hopeful about a ceasefire, but by its very nature, even if ceasefire is agreed to again, and there's been previous ceasefires, it would be of a limited duration. And then the question remains, what happens at the end of the ceasefire? If Hamas is not going to surrender as part of a ceasefire, then eventually the ceasefire will end and the war will resume, because Israel's goal is very clear, and that includes the complete defeat of Hamas. So although there's been talk of a ceasefire in recent days, and maybe President Trump would put pressure on Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire, we have to keep in mind that a ceasefire would only be of limited duration, and it's not the equivalent to the true end of the war. From Israel's perspective, no matter international or even domestic criticism, as long as Netanyahu is in power in Israel, the war will only end once Hamas has been completely defeated.
And Ross, furthermore, what role do you think that United Nations can still play in strengthening the Palestinian cause and making peace between Palestine and Israel?
On this one, I'm sympathetic to President Trump's remarks at the UN last week, and it's very similar to other conflicts around the world, recent conflicts, that is. The UN has largely been absent. It still has a role in the delivery of aid to civilians in Gaza, but has it been a main player in ceasefire talks throughout this period of war that's now almost 2 years? The answer is no, it hasn't. And the key players in ceasefire talks have been Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, not the UN or the UN Secretary General. So if your question is what role does the UN have to play in ceasefire talks or reaching some kind of peace agreement, the answer is none. And the relationship between the Israeli government and the United Nations is very bad at the moment. So it's really unlikely that the UN will play any kind of political role. And in fact, Israel has made it clear that their willingness to allow the UN to play an aid delivery role is limited as well, which is why Israel has looked at and worked with the United States on alternative channels and methods to deliver aid to civilians in Gaza.
And Ross, lastly, what are Israel's responsibilities as an occupying force regarding the protection of Palestinian civilians under Oslo Agreement? And also
certainly, like any belligerent, Israel has obligations to minimize civilian casualties, and the Israeli position is that they've been doing that, and they've made that clear throughout the period of the war. Obviously, a lot of people around other governments around the world will disagree with Israel and say you're not doing enough to protect civilians, but Israel would say that Hamas is embedded in the civilian population. They're fighting from residential buildings, for example, and that's partly why the civilian death toll has been so high. That's not going to change, right? People are going to continue to accuse Israel of ignoring the safety of civilians, and Israel is going to continue to say that Hamas is embedded in civilian and residential areas, and that's going to continue until the war comes to an end.
With that, I would like to thank Ross Feingold for joining us and sharing your insight as a political analyst. Now we move on to our next news. Vietnam plans to evacuate more than 250,000 residents from coastal areas today, ahead of the arrival of Typhoon Bualoi, which is expected to lash the country's steel-producing central belt. The storm, the 10th to affect Vietnam this year, is currently at sea, generating winds of 130 kilometers per hour, and it is expected to make landfall at 7 p.m. local time, according to the Meteorological Agency. Central Vietnam's largest city, Da Nang, plans to evacuate more than 210,000 residents, state media has reported, while more than 32,000 residents of Hue living near coastal areas are also set to be moved to safer areas. More than 15,000 residents in Ha Tin, known as a key steel production hub, have been slated for evacuation to schools and medical centers converted into temporary shelters, authorities have said. Nearly 117,000 military personnel have been mobilized. 4 domestic airports were shut, and all fishing boats in the typhoon's path have been called back to harbor. This is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.